We are just plowing through Lent. Uh, that's probably a better way to say that, but here we are. Lent is a season, as you know by now, that calls us to slow down and reflect, to intentionally create space to connect to God through giving up what's taking up space in our lives and then taking up practices to help us forge those connections. And every year through Lent, it helps me realize just how much I have going on in my life, which I think is certainly part of the point of it. But there's just a lot. Like I need to be present in my relationships with my wife and with my kids and with my friends. There's help with homework and playing. My kids are still at an age where play is a really big deal. There's events to get kids to and from. There's housework, right? There's cleaning, there's bills, there's fixing things when they break. There's everything that goes along with cars, which is just generally a nightmare. There's, regular work, my job here, all the responsibilities and tasks and conversations and just everything. And then trying to, on top of that, take care of myself, eating right, sleeping enough, working out. I'm getting old, so I have to actually pay attention to drinking enough water, things I never thought that I'd have to deal with as a kid. There's just so much going on. And they're all good things, mostly. But being aware of it all the time in my head has made me realize just how much noise I live with and how little space I have. And it can all just wear me down. Maybe you can relate to that. Some of us walked in here tonight feeling tired. Not just physically tired, but existentially tired. Maybe you've had one of those weeks. The kind where everything goes wrong, where people just keep demanding more of you, when you feel like you're running on fumes, and then someone sends you a per my last email message, which is corporate speak for can you even read? This past week, I started a new, very small side gig at an IT firm, which means that I've had to start sending emails back and forth with clients as I'm helping them. And man, it has been a very long time since I've had to use corporate speak, and I cannot say that I missed it. I feel for you who have to do that all day, every day. I haven't gotten any per my last email messages yet, but man, what a treat. Anyway, if that's where you're at tonight, feeling exhausted, we're looking at the story of someone who gets it. His name is Elijah, as Matt alluded to, and let me tell you, this guy knows what it's like to hit a breaking point. Elijah is one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history. He was operating in a time when the people of God are kind of going completely off the rails, indulging in idolatry and immorality. To really appreciate where Elijah is in the story that we're looking at tonight, which is in 1 Kings 19, we need to rewind a little bit to chapter 18. In our story, Elijah is fresh off of victory. Not just any victory, one of the most dramatic and epic showdowns in all of Scripture. The nation of Israel has started worshiping the false god Baal. They do this because their king Ahab and his terrifying wife, Queen Jezebel, encourages them to do this. Elijah, being the bold prophet that he is, can't put up with that, can't abide by that, and so he challenges 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to prove whose God is real, Baal or God. And so the contest, so to speak, goes like this. Both sides prepare a sacrificial ox on an altar of firewood. It's a very Iron Age story. The prophets of Baal will call on their God, and Elijah will call on God. And the real God will answer by sending fire from heaven to ignite the altar. So the prophets of Baal go first. They dance, they shout, they even resort to cutting themselves at one point, trying to get their God's attention. And Elijah stands off to the side, just kind of watching this, and then throwing some of the best trash talk that you'll find in the Bible, certainly in the Old Testament. When nothing happens, when fire doesn't come down from the sky, Elijah starts taunting these false prophets by offering suggestions to them. He says, maybe your God's asleep. Maybe you guys need to yell louder and dance harder. When that doesn't work, he offers maybe he's just on vacation. Like he's just out of the office. Hours go by and nothing happens. So then it's Elijah's turn. And just to make a point, he starts showboating a little bit and he douses his altar in water, soaking the wood, making it even more difficult to ignite. Then he prays just one time, and instantly God sends fire from heaven. It burns up the wood, burns up the stones. Even the water that Elijah had poured on the altar is just evaporated. It's very much a mic drop moment for Elijah. It should be a huge victory lap for him. This should be where he rides off into the sunset, basking in the glow of God's power and having proven that the God that Israel is going after is false and that God is the true God. But instead, in the very next chapter, enraged by Elijah's success, the queen sends him a death threat, basically promising to kill him. Per my last email, Elijah, watch your back. And Elijah just completely crumbles. This same guy who just literally, as far as the story goes, calls down fire from heaven, suddenly panics because he gets a threat. He runs for his life, and not just a short distance, but over 100 miles into the desert wilderness. He had a servant traveling with him. He leaves that servant behind at one point and then just goes deeper into isolation. Then, this is sort of like a very stereotypical, picturesque scene under the cover of a single lone broom tree in the middle of the desert that he finds. Elijah breaks down. He sits at the base of the tree and basically says, God, I have had enough. Take my life. Have you ever felt like that? I'm sure you probably have. Probably not this exact scenario, obviously, but like you've given everything you had and you just can't do it anymore. And everything you had just wasn't enough. This is such a universal human experience. Even the most faithful, the most powerful, the most devoted among us can burn out. That's what's happening here. Elijah isn't just having a bad day. This is like full-on burnout. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, he's just running on empty. And in that moment, when he's so overwhelmed that he's asking for God to end it all, he doesn't need another dramatic miracle. He needs something much simpler. Now, what would you expect God to do here? If you tend to view God as harsh and disapproving, if you're one of those people that tends to think the God of the Old Testament is kind of mean, you might expect God to show up with a bit of a rebuking speech, right? Like, come on, man. You just called fire down from heaven. Like, don't be so weak. Get it together. Or maybe we'd expect God to, again, drop some fire from the sky just to remind Elijah what is actually going on here. But what does God do? We're told that Elijah falls asleep under this tree. We don't know how long he's out, but the next thing that he knows, there's an angel waking him up and saying, get up and eat. And right next to him, he finds loaves of bread and a jar of water. He eats and he drinks, and then he goes back to sleep. And then the angel wakes him up again and says, eat some more, because the journey you're about to go on is too much for you. I don't know about you, but I love that God's first response to Elijah just being at the end of his rope is not disappointment. It's not anger. But he basically says, Elijah, you're cranky. And I get it. Eat a Snickers, drink some water, have a nap, then do it again. Sometimes when you're being crushed by your life, when you're at the end of your rope, when you're burnt out, what you need is just eat a snack and rest. After Elijah eats and rests, he travels, we're told, 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, which is also Mount Sinai. There's lots of things in Elijah's story that echo the story of Moses. And both of those details, him traveling 40 days and 40 nights and coming to this particular mountain, are meant to do just that, echo Moses' story. We don't have time to get into all of that tonight, but if you're wondering why are those details included, that's why. Anyway, Elijah gets to Mount Sinai, he climbs into a cave, and he has himself another nap. And there, he has another encounter with God. Elijah wakes up and he witnesses a series of like supernatural disasters almost. There's a mighty hurricane power wind that comes crashing and destroying rocks all around him. But it says that God is not in the wind. And then an earthquake shakes the ground, but God isn't in the earthquake. And then again, fire blazes from nowhere, burning up everything in sight, but God isn't in the fire. And then, after the fire came a gentle whisper. And it's in that whisper that Elijah finally hears what he needs to hear from God. It's not in the big, dramatic, supernatural occurrences, but it's in this still, small voice that Elijah hears from God. If you fast forward to the New Testament, Jesus, knowing the weight of exhaustion himself, gives this beautiful invitation to us in Matthew 11. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Notice Jesus doesn't say, "Come to me and I'll rebuke you for being crushed by the weight of your own life. Come to me and I'll give you more to do." He says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." Like Elijah, I think it's easy for us to run ourselves into the ground trying to carry everything on our own. And like Elijah, what we need to do isn't more striving, but it's to stop and breathe and listen for the whisper of God. We live in a world where silence is practically extinct. You don't need me to tell you this. When was the last time you sat in complete quiet? I actually tried this as best I could today in this room when no one else was around. All I could hear was my ears ringing because I'm just so used to hearing noise all the time. When was the last time you sat in complete quiet? No phone buzzing, no music playing, no TV in the background, no screen lighting up your face. We've trained ourselves to avoid silence, sometimes at all costs. The moment there's even a hint of quiet, we reach for something, our phones, the remote, we put on a podcast. Even when we happen to be listening to a podcast on mindfulness or silence or rest, we're usually simultaneously scrolling on Instagram. You might be doing that very thing right now if you're listening to this later. We're always plugged in. And I'm not one of those people that says technology is evil. Jesus didn't have a smartphone, right? But if he did, he probably would have used it for good. I don't think it's inherently evil. But we have to ask ourselves, have we gotten so comfortable with noise that we don't even know how to hear God anymore? In our story tonight, we as the readers and Elijah expected God to show up in dramatic supernatural fashion like he did in the story right beforehand. A mighty windstorm, an earthquake, a fire. But God wasn't in those things. Instead, he was in a gentle whisper. And if Elijah had been distracted, as we usually are, he might have missed it. Silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's the space where God speaks. It's where our souls have room to breathe, where we can actually process what's happening in our hearts. But instead of making space for that, we tend to fill every quiet moment with something else. Check our phones. The moments we wake up, we listen to music in the car, we keep a TV show playing in the background while we're doing dishes. We fill our lives with activity, serving and leading and running from one thing to the next so that we don't have to sit alone with our thoughts and be quiet. But if we can't sit in silence, how can we expect to hear the whisper of God? The desert fathers and mothers understood this. They weren't running from the world to be antisocial hermits. They were running toward God. They knew that silence wasn't an inconvenience. It was an invitation. If you've been around the past few weeks, you know that as part of the series, we've been exploring the wisdom of the desert mothers and fathers, which were a group of early Christians in the 3rd century that gave up life in the Roman Empire and traveled out into the Egyptian wilderness to try to hear from God. Abba Moses, one of the desert fathers, puts it this way. He says, "Sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." Now, he wasn't talking about an actual prison cell. They called the little places that they lived cells. Though 5 minutes of quiet feels like a jail sentence for some of us, he meant that when we slow down and embrace stillness, God begins to shape us. What if we carved out real intentional space to listen for God's voice? What if we stopped expecting him to shout over the noise that we subject ourselves to and instead trained our hearts to hear the whisper? Maybe God's been speaking this whole time. We've just been too distracted to notice. It's a scary thought. So what can you take from this? I think there's a few things. Take care of your body and your mind and your spirit. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is rest. The second thing is listen for the whisper. Where can you create space to hear God this week? Sometimes we have to drag ourselves out to the desert wilderness, literally or figuratively, to cut out all the noise of our daily lives so we can listen. And finally, following Jesus is an invitation to real rest, not just more activity, real soul-deep rest. Take that invitation seriously this week. If you're feeling burned out and exhausted or like you just can't keep going, know this: God is not disappointed in you. He's not asking you to push harder. He's inviting you to rest, to listen, and to trust that his whisper is enough. So I want to start by doing this together, finding some stillness together tonight. For the next few minutes, we're going to spend some time in silence, as silent as we can get in here anyway. You might hear the sounds of the rain on the windows. You'll likely hear some noises from the kids' classes. That's okay. Don't worry about that. I'm going to put up some questions for you to think through on the screens that have been helpful for me to reflect on. They're actually from an old school Numa video, for those of you who remember those. But anyway, we're going to spend some time in silence reflecting on these questions. And after a few minutes, I'll come back up to pray. That was only 4 minutes. If you feel like these questions would be helpful for you to continue thinking through this week, please let me know, and I'll be happy to send them to you. I think I need more time. Would you pray with me? God, we want to be people that hear your voice. We want to be people that follow you. Help us to take that seriously enough to relearn the unforced rhythms of your grace, to relearn rest, and to relearn intentionally finding quiet to just listen. God, in the whirlwind of our lives, may we be people who intentionally stop to rest and find your voice, trusting that you will meet us there. We love you, God. Amen.